The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Navigating COVID-19 webinar, Federal and Economic Update. We're really excited to share this with you today in terms of where we are today as a state of the food service industry, as well as just some insight on the next few phases, or a couple of phases that we've gone through and that we are going to be going through. So today, again, really giving you a state of the food service nation. We have our excellent speakers who are joining us today, and then taking a look at the government relations side of the business, as well as the approach and the success and challenges that we are faced with. Today. Speaking today, we have our senior economist, Chris Elliott. Some of you may know him from the RC Leadership Series as the Metalhead Economist, who will share again with the updates in terms of where we are statistically and economically, the challenges facing the food service industry. And then David Lefebvre, the Vice President Federal and Quebec of Restaurants Canada as well, again, giving us that update on the just the government approach that we are taking here at Restaurants Canada. As you may know, my name is Roberto Sarju, Director of Marketing here at Restaurants Canada, and helping you walk you through this. We'll actually be taking questions at the end, so if there's a box on the bottom right-hand side of your control panel there, please feel free to type your questions in at any time during the presentation, and we will be sure to get to as many as we can at the end. If there are any that we don't get to, please feel free to connect with us on any of our social channels or via email. With that said, Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Roberto, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone on the call is keeping well and healthy. So these are certainly unprecedented times, with nearly 2.6 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 around the globe and more than 38,000 confirmed here in Canada as of this morning. The federal and provincial government measures that have been put in place to contain the virus have resulted in large-scale business shutdowns and a significant reduction in economic activity. And as a result, Canada's economy is projected to experience a sharp contraction in the second quarter of 2020. In fact, a recent forecast by the International Monetary Fund predicts that the global economy will experience its largest downturn since the Great Depression. Now, compared to most other industries, Canada's food service industry has been acutely impacted by COVID-19, due in large part to government-mandated social distancing measures. This has led to a steep drop in food service sales, restaurant closures, some temporary as well as some that are permanent, and hundreds of thousands of food service employees being laid off or not working. So given this rapidly changing and complex business environment, Restaurants Canada has sent out a number of surveys to quantify the impact of COVID-19 over the past 10 weeks. So the following slides will illustrate the devastating impact COVID-19 has had on the food service industry, how restaurants are responding, and what the economic outlook is for the remainder of 2020 and early 2021. So if we start off with our first slide, in the first 2 weeks of February, 46% of respondents to our survey said that they had lower same-store sales compared to the same 2-week period in February 2019. Just for context, there were about 8 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Canada at that time. Of that 46% that saw lower sales, most of the respondents attributed that decline to factors other than COVID-19. In fact, it was only 24% of respondents that said they were negatively impacted by the virus. And just going through some of the responses, most of those were Asian restaurants as well. Still, the decline that we saw in early February was discouraging because this comes on the heels of 4 consecutive quarters of lower same-store sales throughout 2019. And that's largely due to a combination of factors such as a moderation in consumer spending, high household debt, and an increase in the number of new restaurant openings. When we look at the next set of data on this slide, when we conducted the survey a month later, the number of COVID-19 cases in Canada had risen to 441. But with more Canadians wary of going out, 78% of survey respondents saw lower same-store sales in the first 2 weeks of March, while only 8% saw an increase. And then if we fast forward again on the next portion of this slide, during the last 2 weeks of March, there was certainly growing anxiety about COVID-19, with nearly 2,800 confirmed cases in Canada. We were seeing social distancing measures take place across the country and restaurants forced to close down the dine-in portion of their business. As a result, we saw 53% of restaurants close down temporarily. And of course, given the situation, a staggering 96% of respondents reported lower same-store sales. We conducted the survey just recently again, and what we found is in the first 2 weeks of April, where there were almost 18,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19, really the similar trend, 95% of respondents showing lower same-store sales. So again, these are numbers that we have never seen before, and certainly in working with Restaurants Canada for the last 20 years, I've never seen statistics like this. If we go to the next slide, when it comes to measuring the actual decline in sales, respondents reported that same-store sales fell by an average of 27.3% in the first half of March compared to the same period in 2019. And then in the second half of March, again, because of social distancing measures and a lot of restaurants that were closing down their dine-in portion of their business, sales fell by an average of 72%. If we break this out by segment, full-service restaurants reported an average decline of about 80%, while quick-service restaurants saw sales decline on an average of 62%. Caterers are certainly down sharply, and the vast majority of drinking places, such as bars, taverns, and nightclubs, were closed during this time. So overall, for the month of March, this represents a 49.7% decline in sales, or $3.8 billion in lost revenue once we include the non-commercial food service sector. Now, please note that these results are not weighted in any sense. They're just based on the best estimates of restaurant operators, but they still give us a really good measure of the dramatic decline in food service operator sales in the last month. If we go to the next slide, we talked about the April sales decline and what's happened in the first 2 weeks of April. The survey is still in the field, so we're still getting some data in here, but I just wanted to share this information with you. So when we look at the data for a unit that has one location or an operator that has one location, sales were down by an average of 81.3% on a year-over-year basis. This includes locations that were closed down temporarily, in which case they saw a 100% decline in their sales. Meanwhile, restaurant businesses with more than one location saw an average decrease of 73.4%. These figures, again, like I said, are still preliminary, so we don't have a breakdown by quick service and table service restaurant at this point. If we move over to the next slide, from our most recent survey, we also asked restaurants what their current level of operations was during the first 2 weeks of April. And nearly half of single-unit restaurant businesses have temporarily closed down all operations. Another 38% have closed down their dine-in operations, but are open for takeout and delivery. It's important to note that even those restaurants that were open for takeout and delivery, their same-store sales fell by an average of 68% on a year-over-year basis. So it was great that they had their doors open, that they were getting some sales, but certainly not enough to offset where they were before. It's also unfortunate that 8% of the respondents to this particular survey have closed down permanently. And just to give you a sense of these single unit operators, the vast majority of the respondents here were table service restaurants. And these were very small restaurants as well. So just a bit of a difference between the results here and what we see on the next slide. When we ask the same question for those that have more than one location, in the vast majority of cases, chain operators kept some of their locations open while closing their other locations, either temporarily or in some cases permanently. On average, 7 in 10 of all chain locations are still open for takeout and delivery, while 25.5% are temporarily closed. So just by way of comparison, you recall that 38% of single unit locations are open for takeout and delivery in the previous slide, compared to 70% for multi-unit operators. So one of the big reasons for this difference is that we're seeing significantly more quick service restaurants that were multi-chain operators that remained open, but typically because they already provide takeout and delivery service compared to some of the single unit table service restaurants. Once again, it's really important to state that even though many chains were open for delivery and takeout, they still experienced a sharp decline in sales. So on the next slide, one of the more notable trends is related to delivery and takeout. For those single unit restaurant operators that are currently offering takeout and delivery, we asked if they had reopened in the past 2 weeks after previously shutting down all operations. And it's interesting to see that just over 40% of respondents have reopened. And we're seeing a similar trend with chain restaurants as well. There are a few reasons why this is happening. One, some restaurants are planned to temporarily close for a few weeks, expecting that the crisis would be over soon and then they could get back to work. But at the same time, they thought, well, this is extending a lot longer than they expected, and they really wanted to start their business back up again in order to keep paying the bills. For other restaurants, they've decided to do a little bit of innovating. Some restaurants have added grocery store items, which is bringing in traffic as people don't want to wait in long lineups at the grocery stores. Also, restaurants that were traditionally dine-in only are now exploring delivery, takeout, and even meal kit options for the very first time. Finally, I think it's also important to highlight that a number of operators pointed out that the 75% wage subsidy was one of the key elements that helped them reopen. If we go to the next slide, so based on our survey results in late March, we estimated that 800,000 food service workers were either laid off or not working any hours. This represented approximately 63% of the 1.2 million food service workers in Canada. With our new survey for the first 2 weeks of April, these results have been relatively unchanged. So we still have about 800,000 that are currently laid off. One of the things I was curious about with the new data is, with some of these new restaurants opening up, would this have some sort of an impact on job numbers? But at this point in time, it seems that there's still a number of 800,000 people that are either laid off or not working. If we go to the next slide, I generally don't like to go too far into the weeds on this, but I just wanted to talk about a few things. In terms of some of the data that we see from Statistics Canada, last month they had talked about how 294,400 had lost their jobs in March. And when we look at the next set of numbers, 233,700 had worked 0 hours in March. So certainly the headline in the news media was about the 294,000 jobs, but when we look at our numbers, we weren't counting just lost jobs, we were also counting those that were not working. So when we add up these two, it equals 528,100 food service and accommodation employees that were laid off or not working during that week. And it's very important to know that the timing of the survey. So during the survey, Stats Canada had the survey in the field between March 15th and March 21st. But most of the restaurant closures, mostly temporarily and some permanent, occurred in the latter part of March. So it really wasn't capturing the full impact of what was happening in the job market. And finally, Restaurants Canada has a much broader measure of what food service employees are, because we also include food service employment not only in accommodation, but also at stadiums, in retail stores, and other segments of the economy. So that's why there's might be, if you see in the media, a bit of a gap between our numbers as well as what's going on with the labor force survey numbers. So I just wanted to explain why those differences exist. But we do expect that with the release of the April data in early May by Stats Canada, that we will see a sharp increase not only in the number of food service employees that have been laid off, but also those that are not working any hours. So we'll probably get closer to that 800,000 lost jobs number. If we go to the next slide, given the decline in sales and that we've seen a steep drop in the number of employees, and of course operators are facing so many major expenses, 50% of single unit restaurant operators have told us that they will need to permanently close their business within 3 months if conditions continue. So basically this means 1 in 2 independent restaurants will have to close in the next 3 months if conditions don't improve. And one of the reasons why is, we can see this on the next slide, the whole issue is that they're just being really crushed by debt. When we look at the numbers, it's just incredible. I think it's 3 out of 4 are seeing very high debt or extremely high debt levels. And of course, rent being probably the most top of mind, especially with rent coming due in early May. So for our respondents, 76% of operators said that rent was the biggest issue for them. And this is not surprising, just because it's one of the major expenses. One of the big keys that came out of the survey was, and one operator put it really well, he said that rent should normally be 6% of sales. In his case right now, it's closer to 75% of sales, because he's just not getting all that revenue in. And so rent is certainly a big key, as well as paying vendors, business taxes, payroll, insurance. And a lot of operators also talked about mortgages and utilities also adding to their total debt. So if we continue on to the next slide, these are obviously desperate times for restaurant owners, and what happens next for the restaurant industry will depend heavily on the post-containment economic recovery over the remainder of 2020 and 2021. In early April, the International Monetary Fund released an updated forecast for 2020 and 2021. They are showing a 3% contraction in global economic output, which represents the largest decline since the Great Depression. It's important to note that this is a baseline scenario, so it does assume that the pandemic fades in the second half of 2020 and that containment efforts can be gradually unwound. After that, the global economy is projected to grow by 5.8% in 2021 as economic activity normalizes, and this will be helped by very strong fiscal and monetary policy support. If we go to the second part of this slide and just sort of look at the G7 countries, these are the ones that are going to be hardest hit. Canada is certainly in the middle of the pack with a 6.2% contraction in real GDP, but they are calling for a 4.2% rebound in 2021. Now, if we go to the next slide, about 3 to 4 weeks ago, all the major banks were predicting a significant and rapid contraction in real GDP in the second quarter of 2020. I think we can see that, yeah. So in the second quarter, they were expecting real GDP to decline anywhere between 10% and 25%. And certainly if you've been watching the news, we've been talking about a sort of V-shaped economic recovery. So that decline in Q2 and then a quick recovery in Q3, as well as Q4. But as I said at the beginning of this webinar, this is a rapidly changing and complex business environment. Yesterday, TD Economics revised their forecast, and here is the new outlook for the economy. So this is not a typo. They now expect a 42% annualized decline in GDP in Q2. To put this in context, the largest quarterly decline during the last recession was 8.7%. This new forecast reflects a greater economic decline than previously expected due to immediate measures by government to contain the coronavirus, but also the collapse in global oil prices. In fact, you may have read in the news on Monday that this week, that US oil prices actually fell below zero for the very first time. As a result, commodity producing countries like Canada are being hurt twice, once with COVID-19 and also the decline in oil. This forecast also calls for a slower recovery in real GDP in the third and fourth quarter. It's sort of hard to see this visually. There is no longer a V-shaped recovery, but just to put it in another way, real GDP is expected to remain below its pre-virus level until mid-2022. So this is a very long phase of a recovery. Also, it's important to realize that this forecast depends heavily on how long containment measures stay in place and how businesses and consumers adapt to this new environment. Restaurants Canada has been asked what will happen to food service sales during the post-containment recovery. And as you can see from previous slides in the last few weeks, we've seen so many huge adjustments to the economic forecast. But with this new TD Economics forecast, I feel a lot better about forecasting with food service sales based on these new numbers, and so expect a new forecast in the coming weeks. So on the next slide here, I think it's helpful just to sort of look back at the 2008-2009 recession. So on a per capita basis, quick service restaurant sales continue to climb, albeit at a slower pace. In contrast, full service restaurants had a slower recovery as people moved over to quick service restaurants and grocery stores. So we see that decline in 2009, stayed lower in 2010, and then started to improve in 2011. Obviously, this will be a different situation. Because of the huge drop in economic activity in Q2, we expect to see a decline in per capita QSR sales this time, and a much larger drop in sales at full service restaurants. In terms of the recovery time, especially for full service restaurants, it'll be much longer than before, especially when it comes to the on-premise dining portion. The other thing that we can look at is what's happening in China. So they are seeing a V-shaped recovery in the overall economy as people are going back to work. So the supply side of the economy is starting to grow, but one of the big challenges is that people are staying home after they go to work. So they go to work, they come home, and they're staying home. They're not going out on weeknights, and they're not going out on weekends. And this means that it's going to be a tough road ahead for restaurants. It's also important to remember that Canadian households were already under a mountain of debt, even before the crisis. A study by BDO found that 53% of Canadians were living paycheck to paycheck. And so with so many people losing their job during this crisis, this will only add to their debt. So discretionary spending at restaurants will be hit throughout the remainder of 2020 as well as 2021. So just as a summary, certainly just based on the numbers that you've seen here, the past 2 months have been devastating for restaurant operators. And again, this comes on the heels of a really challenging 2018 where we had minimum wage increases, Bill 148 here in Ontario, as well as Bill 17 in Alberta, and then in 2019 as well. One of the other things that's come out of this is that delivery is here to stay. We actually may see an acceleration towards ghost kitchens based on this. So typically, ghost kitchen was something that was talked about. We sort of saw a little bit of movement to it. I think based on what's been happening in the last 2 months, for a lot of operators, we'll probably see them accelerate towards ghost kitchens. We're also going to continue to see a further blurring of the lines between food service and retail. Again, a lot of restaurants are now offering groceries, meal kits, prepared meals that people can take home. So it's really going to be hard to tell the difference between retail and food service once all this is over with. Now, I'd like to be able to say that, things are going to jump back into where they were last year and, things will be booming along, but this is going to be a very slow path to recovery. And I also want to caution that because we're in uncharted waters with many, many unknowns, things are going to change rapidly, and we just don't know what's going to happen in the coming weeks. We're just hoping that we get out of this and that we can move on. And I know with the industry being as strong as what it is, it will continue to innovate and it'll continue to grow and get itself through all this. So with that, I will pass the presentation over to David for his update.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's awesome. Some really, insightful and, like you said at the beginning, devastating data shared there, and the impacts of food service. So, while now we know what the numbers look like, David, give us an update on, what's happening on the other end to help.
Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, so good. I wish you a good afternoon. Now I'm going to make a presentation, so we can maybe switch this slide. I'll make the presentation about government affairs and what Restaurants Canada has done on behalf of members in terms of working with governments to try to get some help and to make sure that as many businesses as possible could survive through this crisis, because for us it's very important that for there to be an industry, we need to make sure that individual businesses can survive. So you can see the quick outline there. So the basic of the presentation will be just an introduction to the 4 phases and the 4 different phases that we went through since the start of this COVID-19 crisis. So Roberto, if you can change the slide, thank you. So just maybe take 30, 40 seconds to explain a little bit in the beginning the way it worked, because so many things happening so fast over the last 2 months that we kind of sometimes lose track of what happened. So the first outbreak, of course, was in China. The first known outbreak was in China, especially in the Wuhan region, Wuhan city. And then it spread to Asia and Europe, using various means. One of those to Europe being a lot of the business exchanges, especially in the textile and the garment business. So that's one of the reasons Spain and Italy were among the first and the hardest hits. North America was contaminated a little bit differently because we had some visitors and some people from Asia, especially in the British Columbia and Vancouver region. But the eastern part of the country, which is Quebec, Ontario, and the Maritimes, have been contaminated both by European travelers and also Asian travelers. So just to say that it became everybody everywhere traveling that could be a vector at some point. The initial reaction was a little bit slow to come in terms of closing the borders and those different kind of things. But pretty soon as we went there, economy started to shut down left and right. And of course, we got it to here in Canada, which of course needed a call to action, and provincial governments and the federal government have been acting, especially since mid-March. We can change the slide, please. So one of the first things that we did, so maybe just scroll through all the elements there. So one of the first things we did, because this was critical to the industry, is to make sure that, well, we know that international travel is stopped, but trucks need to go across the border. Trucks need to be able to circulate across the country. And this is one of the first things that we work with the federal government to make sure that we can have an open border for essential businesses. And this is something that Restaurants Canada achieved and started to discuss and achieve as early as early March. We also got help from the producers, the farmers, and the suppliers. So we lobbied those people to make sure that businesses that were able to remain open could be properly supplied. One of the big fights that we had with provinces is that we absolutely needed food service to be recognized as an essential service, because otherwise 100% of the industry would have been shut down. Though not ideal, we worked to, and we were able to salvage the drive-thrus, the takeout, and also everything that deals with delivery. Because one of the things we said, and the governments were really open to this, is that for people that are quarantined or the elderly that cannot really go out, or even to support groceries, maybe some of you don't remember, but 6 weeks ago there were fights over toilet paper in the grocery store. So definitely nobody wanted that to come to a fight, for staples, for grocery, and for food. So having food service open was a way to make sure to relieve a little bit of pressure in the system and to make sure that people can get delivered. Grocery store at the start and even in late March took up to 10 days to be able to deliver something to some people. That didn't work for people quarantined. So food service in the half an hour that you can have for a delivery was pretty efficient. So this proved that we had a unique place in the food chain, and that we were able to salvage some part of the business. Maybe go to the next slide. And again, scroll all the points at the same time. So once we made sure the border was open and the supply chain was functioning, the next step was, of course, to go to the emergency and survival measures. Those were twofold, because we consulted with members and we consulted with our board of directors to know exactly what was going on in the market, what were the needs, and two needs really clearly stood out. So first, well, we need some help for the employees. We need some help for the people that are going to be laid off, for the people that we don't have any hours to give to them. And we're going to need some specific help for businesses. So the first thing that was put in place by the federal government is the emergency response benefit for the employees, the $2,000 per month. And we had to work with the government to make sure that this worked, because at first, you had some employees that said, well, $2,000 a month could be pretty good. Maybe I can just leave my job and go. But we said to government, oh, not so fast. It needs to be the same thing as the employment insurance, that if you voluntarily leave your job, then you're not eligible to the benefit. And this is what the government did. And the other thing that they did that was quite clever, it is something that we advised them on, is to put all the kind of the benefits through the Canada Revenue Agency. So if people are trying to game or cheat the system or try to get things that they should not have, well, they will be caught comes tax time, and they will be able to catch them then. This was very important because we could have faced a situation where people left and drove just to be on the government subsidy, and it's definitely something that would have hampered business continuity now and for a few months. In terms of the business measures, we've worked with government initially as emergency and survival measures for tax deferrals, loans, some kind of break to mortgages. Federal government still has given $50 billion, so $50 billion for mortgage relief through the banks, which is something that's interesting. The other thing for bars and drinking places, Bank of Development of Canada, usually the loans are not accessible if you have 50% or more in terms of alcohol sales. Restaurants Canada got it to be waived across the country. So the goal of those emergency measures is just to provide some cash flow and provide some kind of relief to operators to be sure that they can at least get into the transition. And we also got, some, in those difficult times, sometimes it's good to also have, kudos and some goodwill help from the government. So we got the Prime Minister and also a lot of the premiers to acknowledge the importance of the food service industry, of restaurants, and that, if you can do takeout or delivery once in a while, it's a good thing that you can do to support to support local restaurants. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, yeah. So those items for the emergency measures were important, and just to give you the scope of the importance of that. It was the equivalent of 2 federal budgets presented over the same week. Each time they needed to pass a bill to implement the measures. So Restaurants Canada said, okay, emergency is good. There's some things that have been done, not perfect, but really our focus is for food service operators to be able to apply and, and their workers to make sure that they can get the grants, that they can get the subsidy. But we started thinking and we started discussing with members in our board that, well, we need to move, we need to bridge the gap, because this is not only going to be a 2 to 4 month thing. So we need to move into some kind of recovery measures, business continuity, whatever you want to call it, because there's especially a big danger lurking for independents and franchisee in terms of, well, if this lasts for 3 or 4 months, it's not going to be enough just to have a $40,000 loan. The loan helps, but there's need to be more. And one thing we work with government is a kind of a steep increase of the wage subsidy. Originally, government had announced a 10% wage subsidy. We were able, with other stakeholders and other allies, to push it to 75%, which is a measure that really makes a difference in terms of, both for the workers, but also for businesses to be able to assure continuity. The wage subsidy is going to be eligible, retroactive to March 15 up until June 3rd. And now we're working with government to try to get it for a few more months, just to make sure that it allows as many businesses as possible to remain alive and to be able to get it in order to move forward. Yesterday, the new calculator has been put in onto the page of the Canadian Revenue Agency, so you can go there. It gives you an estimate of the kind of subsidy you could receive. You will be able to apply to this as early as next Monday, which is April 27th. And the government promises that 90% of the applications will be treated and given a yes or no, hopefully much more yeses than no's, by May 5th. And then the next step, so the first step is kind of the wage subsidy, which is a measure that is in between immediate relief and recovery. So now we're working on things that will be really more medium term, even long term. So working on rent, Prime Minister Trudeau has announced on Monday that there will be a program for rent that is going to be worked alongside the provinces, which makes things a little bit longer because you need to have kind of 10 premiers plus the Prime Minister and all their different bureaucracy to align themselves. But I've heard some good progress from Manitoba, Quebec, and also Saskatchewan. So things are moving along in terms of rent relief, because rent, it's the number one fixed cost for most of you. The number one fixed cost, mostly it's mortgage or rent. And for independent operators, it's much more often rent than mortgage. So it's important for us to work on that. Big press release coming out tomorrow, media operation. I will also appear on behalf of Restaurants Canada at the Finance Committee, the Federal Finance Committee tomorrow, where this issue will be definitely discussed. So we ask for no eviction, rent relief, and also some kind of partnership with the landlords. The next 2 steps that we're going to work in terms of the recovery will be some kind of a deal with insurance, because insurance, it's not the first fixed cost, but oftentimes it would be the second. It's a difficult situation for people to be able to file the claims, and also it's something that, it's hard for you for the claims to be honored and given to you. So definitely it is something that we're going to work in the private space, but also with government. And last but not the least, moving into the recovery, suppliers will be paramount to your business, because it's one thing to reopen, it's another thing to make sure that you have the food stuff that you need to sell. And I think 95% of operators consider food stuff as being the most important, variable cost outside of labor. And labor is taken care of with a wage subsidy and also with the people that are laid off. And we need to do something in terms of the supply. We're at the table with FCPC, Retail Council, various organizations, and of course lobbying government to try to get something to make sure that we can continue to provide supply to the food service operations. Maestro, we can go to phase number 4. Next slide. The next slide is not really something that we've worked 100% with government now, but just to give you an idea of what's lying ahead, what are going to be the next steps. Because as much as we're in the middle of a crisis and there's a little bit of a panic and the times are very hard for everybody, which is something we 100% recognize, Restaurants Canada also always wants to look forward to the future needs that are going to arise in the industry, And one thing that we want to make sure is to fight so a maximum of food service operations, especially restaurants, are able to remain in business, because otherwise there just will not be an industry. And restaurants are in every community across the country, part of the social fabric. So we definitely consider restaurants part of the social life and also part of what makes this country as great as it is right now. And this country can get even better in part because of us. So we're working with governments, especially at the federal level, to have some kind of ad campaigns for local products, local restaurants, local people, once things starts to be able to reopen. We are working in some provinces and with federal government into what could look like a long-term development program for, for tourism, for food service, and things like that. Restaurants Canada has a tremendous expertise through its media publication. We do the largest trade show in the country, so we're willing to leverage all those parts into what could look like a long-term development program to make sure that we stay in the game. Tourism focused niche experience, it's on the slide. It's something very important for some people. We expect fine dining, caterers, and those kind of businesses will be especially hit hard once the businesses reopen, and we just want to make sure that we can be there for you. And we want to be there for you because the new normal and the new world that we're going to get into is not going to be the same as before. First, you have a lot of businesses in terms of delivery and drive-through and other kind of things that have adapted their business to the thing. Chris discussed, what the ghost kitchen is and those kind of things, and we discussed that at the trade show. It's going to be very important. It's also going to be very important to recognize that there's going to be more inspection, more fines for salubrity, for cleanliness and those kind of things. And we want to make sure that we're on top of the game, working with government even before those new measures are put into place. So social distancing is something new in our industry, but it's something that's going to last for a while. And as much as we want to relaunch the food service as soon as possible, we can understand that, we're probably going to be able to restart at the same time as hairdressers, gyms, and those kind of things. So probably not at the same time as construction and road work, but we should be able to relaunch before stadiums, large concerts, conventions, and those kind of venues where you have multiple thousands of people at the same place at the same time. Let's go to the next slide. In conclusion, well, I've been saying it for the last months. I am ready to buy a crystal ball. If someone has one to sell, just send me a private email. I might be interested because we still don't know exactly what's going to happen. What we know is that something will relaunch first, something will relaunch last, and it's probably going to be different within, between different provinces, probably even different, some regions in the provinces. Maybe large cities open quicker, maybe large city open later. We just don't exactly know at this point. As the problem is moving slowly from a global epidemic and pandemic in Canada to something a little more localized to nursing home, old age people, maybe there's going to be a shift in terms of what's allowed to open, what's not allowed to open. Maybe schools go first now. It is something all governments are working on, and many of them, especially Quebec, Ontario, should unveil a more definite plan over the next week. But for sure, safety and hygiene are going to be very important, not only from a business perspective, but also from a government affairs perspective, because there's going to be new regulations and new legislations, and we need to be there at the table, and we're going to be there at the table for you. Are there some blue skies at last that are coming? Yes, they are. But my own little crystal ball, which I didn't pay a lot of money for, tells me it's going to take quite a long time for the regular situation to come back, if only because the social distancing measures are going to be problematic, especially for bars, drinking places, and also restaurant dining rooms. But we want to make sure to get this right, because if we restart too fast, and if the restart doesn't go as well as planned, and you start to have other outbreaks and other infections and other people that get sick, well, then it could take a very long time for everything to relaunch. So just so you know, we work federally, we work provincially. Restaurants Canada has represented you and is representing you every step on the way, and we're still going to be there doing it. Like I used to say, when the crisis started, COVID was maybe 50% of what I did, but pretty quickly it became to 95%, even close to 1% of what I'm doing. And I expect for the next year one year from now, I expect probably a third of my work will still be about the COVID. So just to tell you, the time it will take. But if we do it right, and we can work with businesses and with food service along the way, we're sure we're going to be able to make the situation as good as possible under these very difficult circumstances. So thank you very much for your attention. And I guess many of you have sent some questions. Happy to try to answer them as much as possible with the information that we currently have.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, David. I think that was a great recap of the 4 phases that we're in right now, and what we're going through. If you were, Dave, to tell me sort of what phase we're in right now, where would that fall? Are we phase 2, phase 3?
That's a good question. I would say where we are we're currently in phase 3 right now in terms of pushing government for changes, new programs, better programs. But I would say we still have half a foot in phase 2 because there's a lot of those programs that we still need to have the details. People will be able to start to apply. We start to see what are the problems here and there in the market, so we can go back to them with further questions and try to make those programs better. So I would say we have half a foot in step 2. We're fully in step 3, and we're also looking forward and starting to have the discussion with the step 4, especially on the business and industry side, but also with government, because we want to make sure not to be caught flat-footed once we get to that phase. I say phase 1 in terms of the border, the supply chain, everybody's on board, and federal government has even recognized food chain supply, including food service, is one of the top national priority, and they're ready to put the army to it should it come to that. It's not going to come to that, but I mean it's has high priority that they would mobilize the army to help in terms of the food supply. So we're more into phase 3, but looking back and forward at the same time, because our members are doing so and require us to do so, and it is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. While we are day to day maybe feeling the effects of phase 2 and trying to navigate some of the rules, restrictions, guidelines, what we have to do to submit, we're also taking a look at phase 3, phase 4, and what does that look like. Makes total sense. We're kind of playing each phase as it comes. One of the questions that have come through as well is, you talked about tourism, David, and Chris, you showed some of those numbers. How does COVID-19 impact tourism to Canada this summer? As we know, food service is one of the biggest contributors to tourism overall. Any insight into that?
Yeah, Roberto, I think it's going to be one of the, again, much like everything else, a lot of unknowns. Last week, I saw an article that had come out that said that global tourism revenues are expected to decline by 20 to 30% in 2020. Now, having said that, forecasts and projections, they change on a day-to-day basis, so this could get worse. We are in uncharted waters, but I think it's helpful to also break it down this way, that if you think about overall tourism to Canada, 80% of those international visitors to Canada comes from the US. Only 20% come from countries other than the US. And of those 80% of American visitors, 70% are coming to Canada by car. So they all live in border communities, and they're sort of making those same-day trips to Canada. I think once the borders reopen, that'll happen steadily and slowly, and I'm not sure it'll be May and June, July, or August. But once those borders start to slowly reopen, I think we'll probably start to see some pickup in tourism activity in the border communities. And there's a few reasons to be optimistic about this, because we do have low gas prices, which certainly helps on the tourism side. We have a very favorable exchange rate. The US economy is going to come out of this a little bit stronger than Canada, so that will certainly help drive some of the traffic and tourism to Canada as well. And at the same time, we just don't have as many Canadians traveling abroad this year. So I think what we'll see is probably a lot more marketing from the different tourism marketing boards, but also from the restaurants, marketing to domestic visitors and domestic travelers rather than international travelers. So I don't have any specific figures in terms of what a decline in tourism will be, but I think that there are some positive factors that will help offset or help mitigate some of the decline that we may see from overseas travel.
No, that's some great insight there. Another question, and I think David, this goes on to you, and you did touch on it, but can you just quickly revisit where we are on the rent issue and our advocacy around that? Just wanted clarification on timing and how that conversation is going. I believe you said those conversations are happening. You know, alignment with premiers, alignment with federal. Just wanted to clarify that where we are with that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question because regarding the presentation, rent is obviously the number one fixed cost for every tenant in the industry, basically for every tenant, and we've been in discussion with federal government in some provinces since at least the second week of March because pretty soon it was obvious that, you know, especially for the businesses that are closed and shut down, well, that April 1st will come, then May 1st, then June 1st. So the work on rent, the thing that's a little bit more complicated with rent is because rental agreements in between private parties, so a tenant and a landlord, are of provincial jurisdiction. So it's not something that the federal government can say, oh, let's do that, and then everybody will follow. They need to find agreements with the provinces. So one of the first things that we worked was for some deferral and relief with property taxes in the largest cities in the country, which is something we were able to achieve in many places. But the next step is to do something in terms of the rent. Sometimes for quick service or for some people that are in food courts or kind of this, it's a little bit easier because they would rent the unit to their franchisors or something like that. But you need to have something for franchisees, but also for independent businesses, you know, family restaurants and the likes. And this is where we're moving in terms of working with government is something that could be, you know, partly shared by government, by the landlord, and by the industry in terms of making sure that, you know, and not only a deferral. I mean, a deferral of rent is something that's interesting in the short term, but moving more into this phase 3, for example, we'll be looking at something that would not be a bailout, of course, but will be maybe some kind of, you know, something that could be a loan that is you know, forgiven after a certain number of time and as you repay it, or there could be, you know, some part of government, you know, accepting to pay or to at least to front some money in terms of the rents. So the ask is pretty complex, but the basic thing and the first thing is no eviction policy in all provinces and across the country. And so because this helps you find an arrangement, and for government to propose a standard arrangements that will require financial participation from governments in order to alleviate all the pressure that is on the rent. And we think this is something that could be retroactive because, you know, April 1st is passed and March 1st is in 8 days.
So and that and because that's a cooperation has to be between federal and provincial, it may differ province by province, correct?
Well, the federal government is looking for a national program and for the conditions to be the same everywhere, which is something Restaurants Canada approves and support. But the delivery of the program and the, you know, the way you apply in a province compared to another could be different. But one of our main asks is to make sure that every small business in the country, under the same considerations and under the same criteria, would have the same eligibility, no matter the province you're in.
Perfect. No, thank you for that clarity. I think that's helped. Another question I had was on the wage subsidy. The 10% wage subsidy as it relates to 75% wage subsidy, are both still available? Or is there one off the table? How does that work? Any clarity on that?
Yeah, my understanding is that the government, as people apply from next Monday on the 75% wage subsidy. So this wage subsidy is going to be made available for members and people that are still on payroll. So this is the wage subsidy that is offered right now by federal government. It is a federal program. It is administered by the Canadian Revenue Agency. The calculator is already on the website, but the full form and the full application will be available as soon as Monday. This is what the government says, and there's no reason to think it's going to be different. So this is the wage subsidy program that is going to be in place for operators.
That's awesome. Now, Chris, over to you really quickly. There, you know, we saw the original forecast that came out from the banks, and then TD came out with theirs. Why was there such a big revision? Like, you know, you don't typically see that.
No, this is absolutely unprecedented. And I think what really, and I wasn't in the room with TD Economics when they were doing this, I think they were absolutely spooked by the 22 million people that have sought unemployment benefits over the past 4 weeks. And if you've walked around the city and done the whole social distancing thing, it's pretty easy to see that most restaurants have been closed. Most retailers are closed. A lot of businesses, there's nobody out. And of course, this is going to drive up the unemployment rate. And now they're thinking it's a 16.5% average unemployment rate in Q2. But in April, it may be as high as 25%. So I think the combination of more unemployed than they expected, plus the fact that they're starting to see some initial information about what's happening in the retail sector. I'm sure they've seen our numbers and what's been happening, the housing market, industrial production. They certainly paint a much bleaker than expected picture. And I think part of the way that what happens with these banks is, I think a lot of them are kind of afraid to, like, we want to be the outlier and kind of come out with that extreme example. But I have to say, I think TD absolutely nailed the forecast in terms of what's happening, which certainly gives me a lot more confidence in terms of what we can expect to happen when we do our forecast, because we'll be relying on those numbers. And just for those that are listening in, our food service sales forecast is generally tied very closely to what goes on in the economy. So economic indicators such as GDP, disposable income, the unemployment rate, tourism, all of those play a role when we do an economic forecast. So I'm starting to feel a little bit more confident about producing a forecast about the next 6 to 8 quarters now than what I was with the initial data.
And can you just, for those tuning in, when is the next forecast or report out that would take into these numbers into consideration? Because we do have our monthly info stats that give a little bit of insight, but what are some of those tools that operators can use today?
So we have an Outlook survey that was just launched yesterday, which really I think goes into a little bit more detail in terms of some of the numbers that I presented today. And so that's up on our portal. I would say the forecast as well is probably going to be the next big report. It's going to be a high level forecast, so it won't break everything out into the different segments yet. Not quite as confident on that level, but I figure probably within the next 2 weeks, we'll start to have a forecast. And in which case businesses, suppliers, manufacturers can start using this as a bit of a guideline in terms of how to plan forward over the next 6 to 8 months or 6 to 8 quarters. But we've sort of been taking a cue from the Bank of Canada. They had decided not to release a specific forecast. They put sort of examples of this is where we think things may head. They've actually used the term false precision in terms of that's what they don't want to do in terms of their forecast. And I think we're taking the same road. We just don't want it to be false precision in coming out with a forecast that when we know everything is changing so rapidly, so quickly, that a forecast can be out of date within 24 hours, the way things are going these days.
It changes by the hour, it feels sometimes. No, thank you for that, Chris. There are a few more questions that we probably won't have time for, but I just want to get to one more. David, over to you. You talked about our involvement on the insurance side of the business. There were things such as business interruption insurance and some of those things that fit into the business that either you could claim or not claim. Can you give some clarity on what we're doing on that side from an insurance perspective?
Yes, in terms of the insurance, a little bit like the rent, it's a private contract between two private entities. So in terms of the oversight from government, it's a little bit different than employment insurance or wage subsidy or something like that can already be built into what are actual already some government responsibilities. So insurance is trying to find a place where government can maybe guarantee some of the payments and those kind of things or the deferrals, because it's becoming hard for some operators to be able to pay their own insurance. And even if you're close, you need to pay for the fire insurance, for the burglary insurance, and those kind of things. And there's not that many insurance policy that add a pandemic or something like COVID-19 or the coronavirus in there to help the operators. So it's definitely one of the questions we raise with government and something that we want to try to move forward. A little bit like the rent. It's a work in progress, but we've been at it for over a month, and hopefully we're going to be able to have something in order to have the cash flow and to have more operators to stand up at the end of this crisis.
Nope, that's awesome. We're just coming up to the top of the hour in a couple of minutes. So with that said, I thank you for all the questions that have come in. If you have any more questions, feel free to contact us through our social channels or via email. Many of the questions that actually came in, you may be able to find the answers on our Navigating Coronavirus resource page. You can find that at restaurantscanada.org/COVID-19. You'll find some questions answered in regards to health and safety, in regards to what government actions have taken. I urge you to, if you're looking for clarity on that, visit the provincial and federal resources page. On that page, you will find our federal and provincial response plans handbook. Now, this handbook is updated almost daily with any new updates that are coming down from federal or provincial governments on the programs that some of the programs we spoke about today and more. So please download that for the most up-to-date information. If you are not getting that, please sign up for our email newsletter. You'll receive that in our newsletters as well. So again, a ton of great resources there, webinars, guides, FAQs, and so on and so forth. And finally, it is Wednesday. So as you know, as we try to navigate this pandemic together, I'd like to encourage everyone to get on board and share Canada Takeout Day with the hashtag Takeout Day. It's all about supporting local restaurants. So if you are not on the list yet, so please visit CanadaTakeout.com, submit your restaurant to the map. There is a large consumer campaign around this initiative that you'll see on all the major networks as well as online, and it encourages the public to go out to their local restaurant, their local favorite restaurant, enjoy a meal. And tonight we'll actually be having a live stream of the Great Canadian Kitchen Party with some great Canadian artists such as Alan Doyle, Julie Black, and hosted by George Strombolopoulos. And that's happening on Facebook, Great Canadian Kitchen Party at 8 p.m. So Chris, David, I want to thank you so much for your time today. Incredibly insightful, incredibly beneficial. I want to thank you all for tuning in, for coming here today. Thank you, everyone, and please stay safe, and we'll get through this together. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.